This is the expanse to which most Americans define terrorism. Hell, this clip from the popular American TV show Family Guy represents the American perception of terrorism at its finest.
Mohammed Atta stayed home.
So what is terrorism? Is terrorism limited to the sphere of Muslim fighters or Islam? Or is it much more extensive? Webster's dictionary defines terrorism as the use of terror or fear, especially as a means of coercion. So with that in mind, let us discuss terrorism performed not upon Americans, but by Americans. Although terrorism occurred in America before the 1800s, such as the introduction of slavery and the forceful removal of thousands of Indians, this was not American per se, as it was the consequence of a European influence and a weak nation. Thus I begin my narrative in 1800, when America became an independent and stable nation. Thomas Jefferson, the man who would define the American definition of freedom, who would then ironically deny Americans of this freedom. He would deny the Americans who lived on her soil for generations this freedom. And the Americans whose labor, blood, sweat, and tears set the backbone and foundation of this nation, this freedom. His method of absolving himself? Writing in his diary about the evils of it, yet doing nothing to solve it. And in fact, making things worse by sucking out what little freedom they had, formerly known as the Louisiana Purchase and the cotton industry. He took their source of happiness and livelihood and reduced it. He took their little liberty and freedom and eradicated it, all to achieve his perception of the American dream. In the 1830s, President Andrew Jackson and his troops, the majority Southern cotton farmers, despite the ruling of the Worcester v. Georgia case, forcefully removed thousands of Indians in the South to reservations. All for what? To achieve their perception of the American dream. Nevertheless, we honor him by placing him on the $20 bill, as we view the violent killing, slaughtering, and dislocation of thousands of women and children as bravery, courage, and selflessness. Abraham Lincoln, the man whom we credit with the end of slavery, the president who lost his life in the push for equality and freedom for all. However, most don't know. While he gave freedom and liberty to the black people of America, he further stripped the Native Americans of this freedom. He, Abraham Lincoln, 3 days after signing the Emancipation Proclamation, a document that would end slavery in Confederate territory, would then sign the Dawes Act, an act that would strip Northern Lakota and Sioux Indians of thousands of acres of land, effectively giving freedom to one while taking it away from the other, all to achieve his perception of the American dream. Following the Civil War, the birth of the word terrorism would take place. Mind you, not in the Middle East or any Islamic nation, but in America. The Ku Klux Klan, an organization whose sole purpose was to suppress black voters and the voters of the Republican Party through threats, rituals, and executions, all to achieve their perception of the American dream. Fast forward a few years, and in 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt ordered the arrest of thousands of innocent Japano-Americans and sent them to detention camps, all because they feared that they threatened their perception of the American dream. Sadly, the oppression doesn't stop there. It magnifies. For before World War II, American oppression was constrained within its borders. But after World War II, it spread beyond it. It spread to regions all over the world, such as China, Latin America, and most importantly, the Middle East. Its oppression spread from as far as the Mediterranean Sea to as deep as the Himalayan mountains. But for the sake of today's speech, I will give you a brief history of the three most significant ones: Iran, Afghanistan, and Iraq. First, let's briefly discuss the history of Iran and how U.S. influence led to the creation of Hezbollah. 1953. The CIA organizes a coup to remove popular Premier Mohammad Mossadegh with Reza Shah Khan, a U.S. puppet who wanted to reform Iranian society from an Islamic one to a Western one. 1954 to 1957. Muslim people who were horrified by the radical changes in Iran began protesting against the government and their westernization process. 1957. Reza Shah Khan creates the Savak, a secret police force whose task is to suppress any and all forms of protest and rebellion. 1979. The majority religious Muslim population has had enough. They recruit Ayatollah Khomeini and ask him to lead a revolution against the corrupt government, formerly known as the Iranian Revolution. 1980. After losing control of Iran, the U.S. sends troops all over the Middle East in fear that the Iranian Revolution will spread and they will lose their control and influence in the Middle East. Thus, by meddling in foreign internal affairs, the United States created a state of hostility and hatred that fostered the creation and growth of several radical organizations, such as Hezbollah, effectively creating Islamic terrorism. Now let's take a quick dive into the history of post-World War II Afghanistan and its correlation to 9/11. 1980. The Soviet Union begins to invade Afghanistan, known as the Soviet-Afghan War. 1981. The U.S. is still recovering from the Korean and Vietnam War. Thus, instead of sending troops to Afghanistan, they send weapons to the Mujahideen, Afghani local warlords, and ask them to defend themselves against the Soviets. 1989. The Soviet Union gives up on its attempt to capture Afghanistan, and the Mujahideen return back home. 1990. The government of Afghanistan is in disarray. Ex-Mujahideen become local oppressive warlords and begin terrorizing the urban and rural people of Afghanistan. 1994. Mullah Omar and his Pashtun students rise together to end the oppression of the Mujahideen and establish a theocracy based on a radical interpretation of Islam, or the Taliban. Again, by interfering in foreign internal affairs, the United States, not some Islamic country, created an environment that forced radical groups such as the Taliban to emerge. Thus, to solely blame Afghanistan for the events of 9/11 would be naive, for they may have pulled the trigger, yet we loaded the rifle. Finally, let's look at the reasons behind the creation of ISIS. August 2nd, 1990. Saddam Hussein and his army invades Kuwait in hopes of getting control of its oil mines and ports. August 8th to 9th, 1990. U.S. troops land in Saudi Arabia with the mission of removing Iraq from Kuwait. 6 months later, U.S. kills between 100,000 and 200,000 civilians with its night raids, bombings, and sends troops to actively patrol Iraq, effectively inserting themselves in a foreign nation. This in turn led to the creation of radical organizations who simply strive for freedom, ISIS. Now I ask you, how can we call Thomas Jefferson a patriot, yet call Muslims seeking freedom a terrorist? How can we justify the imprisonment of thousands of innocent Japano-Americans, but not justify the retaliation of liberty-seeking Muslims? How can we call the stealing of 4 million square miles as necessary, but call the taking of 7,000 square miles as tyrannical? How can we call others terrorists when we as the nation are the source of it? The answer? Our American egocentrism. No matter how many lives we lose and take, no matter how much tax money we waste or how much destruction we create, it's all justified as long as we are on top of the world. So I ask you, was the war in the Middle East a fight against terrorism or a fight for global attention? Thank you.